Welcome. I hope you're all enjoying the conference so far. We're very fortunate to have Ken Davis here to speak with us today. Ken was one of the organisers of the very first Mardi Gras. He's also been a co-convener. I've also been a co-convener of First Mardi Gras, a group of 160 or so activists from the first Mardi Gras. And we also have Geraldine here to speak from Solidarity. Before we do start, there are two books that I wanted to sort of plug, and if people are really interested in learning more about the theory behind what we're talking about, but also about the politics, they're really great books to start with. The Red and the Rainbow, Sexuality, Socialism and LGBT Liberation, a bit of a smaller one I highly recommend. And to go a little bit deeper, Lindsay German's Sex, Class and Socialism. If you're new and you haven't got a magazine yet, I really encourage everyone to get a copy of the mag as well, covering, it's got that great photo. I don't know if people have seen the video, it's fantastic, where she shuns Turnbull. Anyway, without further ado, we'll let our speakers start with Ken. Thanks so much.
So I apologise for a couple of people that have heard this sort of stuff before, so I hope it's not too boring, and I actually wish I was in the Palestine session. Just a couple of references before I start. Amy's done quite a good article that covers a lot of this in Overland, so people should read it. And I don't know if I'm endorsing it. Martin Duberman, who's a gay Jewish historian from New York, has written a very interesting book which is sort of covering some of the territory from a New York perspective. I don't think he might be a Marxist, but he's not necessarily a revolutionary. So, you know, I'm not saying it's fabulous, it's just interesting. I guess people saw the film, right? Yeah? Yeah. Great, okay. I want to say how happy I am to be here because this building and the SRC and the quad and the tin sheds and the home building were incredibly important in the history of lesbian and gay activism here in Australia, and particularly in relation to the first Mardi Gras in 1978. And that sort of specific history, which is related to the left, and the left at this university in particular, is not very well recorded. There were two organisations here, Sydney Gay Lib, which actually wasn't that radical, and Ad Hoc Active Defence of Homosexuals on Campus, which was mainly Communist Party. And they were very, very important in the first Mardi Gras. I wanted to celebrate the first Mardi Gras. You know, the situation now is pretty bleak, so I wanted to try and be a bit celebratory, you know, because I'm old and it's 40 years ago. But I wanted to contextualise it in relation to the 50th anniversary of 1968, because I don't think you can understand the movement and how it gets to the situation of the first Mardi Gras if you don't think about the decade of revolutionary change globally that generated a new period of the women's liberation movement and a new radical gay and lesbian liberation movement. So just start with 67. 67, out of 126 members of the United Nations, 17 were democracies. Now, okay, we've got to critique of bourgeois democracy, but what I'm talking about is democratic space. So for us becoming radicalised in the early 70s, the world system that we were confronting was very, very different from, you know, what you can assume now in terms of our ability as social movements or the labour movement to have space to organise. 67, Cultural Revolution in China, the killing of Che Guevara, massive upsurge of civil rights in the United States. You know, Malcolm had been killed in 65 and Martin Luther King 68. And there was the Summer of Love, which it was, you know, kind of cultural upsurge, but, you know, very related to the peace movement. 68, in the majority world, or the third world as it was called then, the Vietnamese Tet Offensive, upsurge against apartheid in what was then Rhodesia and South Africa. The massive upsurge in Mexico that led to the killing of hundreds of students on the eve of the Olympics in Mexico City. Upsurge in Brazil, in Turkey, in Pakistan and in Thailand. In the Soviet bloc against Stalinism, upsurges in Prague, in Poland and in Yugoslavia. And in the West, most notably the possible revolution in France with the unity of both youth and workers, a long period of revolutionary struggle in Italy, the upsurge in the United States, in Germany and in Japan. That was followed very soon after by the upsurge of a new women's liberation movement and gay liberation movement. And in terms of the gay liberation movement, it wasn't just from the Stonewall and from the United States, it was also from the revolutionary situation in Mexico and in France. In Australia, the first organisations were around 1970, Australian Lesbian Movement and CAMP, and then a bit later, Gay Lib. But just to say what was happening in the global context that was motivating us in the left and in the gay liberation movement. 71, war in Nigeria, the conflict that's known around Biafra, the independence war in Bangladesh, and a mass revolutionary upsurge in Sri Lanka that was put down by the government with the help of the United States, Britain, Russia and China. Here, of course, Whitlam was elected in 72. In 73, mass democratic transitions in Greece, but also the coup in Chile. How do things like that relate? I remember in the first Gay Pride Week, we moved from our own demonstration to the demonstration outside the American Embassy because we just heard that Salvador Allende had been killed. In 74, people talked yesterday about the Portuguese Revolution and the impact on Angola, Timor, Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique, and the overthrow of, or the death of Franco, I suppose, not the overthrow. 75, the victory of the Vietnamese people and Cambodian people and Lao people against imperialism. And then at the end of the decade, revolutionary transformations that didn't necessarily end well in Nicaragua, Grenada, Iran and Afghanistan. And then 1980, Solidarność in Poland. So the birth of our movement here was framed by that revolutionary decade. And so what that did was it strengthened tendencies, counterculture, you know, the hippies, social democratic parties, particularly the left of the social democratic parties, the communist parties, particularly the Euro-communist parties, like in Australia, Maoists, Trotskyist organisations, which were mainly formed here in 1970, 70, so on, anarchists, and what we forget is armed struggle organisations in Australia, but more particularly in Europe, United States and Japan. Just to remember what shaped me as a high school student was getting the little red school book, which, you know, distributed outside the school, with extraordinarily straightforward information about sex and drugs and politics. The film If, which came out in '68. Anyone know this film? Oh, try and look at it. It's this extraordinary film with a sort of homoerotic note, where boys in a ruling class boarding school in Britain end up massacring the parents, the bishops, the military and the parliamentarians. And behind it is the 1964 Miss Aluba from the Congo. So it was sort of a bit inspiring, you know, the idea that, I mean, to watch it as a schoolboy was sort of interesting, you know. There was graffiti at Central Station, World Revolution is the drama of our time. I remember Huey Newton from the Black Panthers said that homosexuals were the most oppressed and therefore the most revolutionary. And that really, I don't know if that's true, but at the time it sounded pretty interesting. I got a hippie publication at Paddy's Markets with Martha Shelley's Gay is Good manifesto. And I remember, we are the extrusions of your unconscious mind, your worst fears, your most treasured secret desires made flesh. So it was sort of heady times. The gay liberation movement was fairly pluralistic and inclusive, but it was campus-based and student-based. The differentiation with CAMP was not clear. I mean, CAMP had more workers, but what we think now is, you know, CAMP was more conservative and Gay Lib was more radical. It wasn't that straightforward. Gay Lib had some conservatives. It had Liberal Party people and Liberals. It had people, religious people. It had people in Young Labor, like me. It had a lot of people from the Communist Party, a lot of Trotskyists, anarchists and counterculturists. I think I drew some lessons from that initially as a school student and then a university student involved. Obviously, the first is that personal questions are political questions. We learned that not only from the women's movement, but also from part of the Maoist movement, I guess. We did consciousness raising groups, and the importance of that was that we saw our situation not as personal pathology, but we identified common problems that we should struggle against collectively, and that we fought internalised heterosexism. We realised that oppression and repression, and I know Foucault says we're not allowed to say that, but oppression and repression is systematic and structural. We realised that sexuality and gender are socially constructed. Now this is very uneven because we realised that, but at the same time we said things like we're the same as the witches or the faggots or the guys in the molly houses in Britain, or, you know, that there's a sort of homosexual essence that lives through history. And today you will still see people, or, you know, in political demonstrations saying, you know, I'm born a lesbian or I'm born a gay man. So I think the main victory was understanding the social construction of gender and sexuality, but that's never been clear to most participants in our movement, and probably wasn't that clear to me either. We struggled for identity. Like, the main identity in Australia was PUF or camp. Camp covered women and men. It's a bit hard to explain all the history of that. And then there was a move towards identifying as homosexual, which was the identity that our movement had created in the 1850s. But then towards adoption, and this was not easy in Australia, the adoption of what we saw as American identities of gay and lesbian. And gay at the time was very inclusive. It meant that an important part of your life was your attraction to people of the same gender, that you recognised that was oppressed and you wanted to struggle collectively against it. So it was rare at the time for gay to mean exclusively homosexual. And in fact, most people in gay lib, and indeed in the early days of lesbian liberation, were having gender discordant sex, apart from myself. A lot of the left, the Communist Party and the group I was in, the Trotskyist movement, supported autonomous movements. And I know in the tradition here that was a little bit more nuanced. But movements defined by objectives around the liberation of sexuality. We emphasised visibility and coming out. And in a world at the time when there were virtually no public lesbians or gay men, and only a few very public transsexuals, that visibility question and coming out was exceptionally important. We wanted public or mass action, sometimes defined as civil disobedience, as the main method of political activity. We had an understanding of United Front mobilisation. This was different from the gay leadership of the Communist Party. So we thought we would mobilise around specific demands and mobilise as many people as possible around those specific demands while maintaining, you know, political differences on a range of other things. The Communist Party, is like Brian McGahan, read Dimitrov, and they applied the Popular Front theory to the Sydney gay movement and gay community. I know that sounds bizarre, but it's actually quite important in the history of the Mardi Gras. We believed in alliances with other movements, the labour movement, the student movement, the women's movement, the land rights movement as it was. We believed in internationalism, and I think at its better part, the movement still does that. Through the work of people like Lauritsen and Thorstad from the American Socialist Workers' Party, we recovered the history of the movement, which we were ignorant of until the early 70s. So we suddenly understood that there'd been a lesbian and gay movement from the 1850s, and its intimate connection with the social democracy and the Bolsheviks. And that was an extraordinary discovery that, a lot of us had thought we were doing something for the first time, but uncovering the backstory prior to 1933 was incredibly important. And the most important thing was we brought to the struggle camp sensibility, and that's characterised a lot of the activity in the movement for quite a while. We were very subtle and nuanced in our demands, so we had an analysis of oppression, and so we had slogans like smash heterosexuality, and what we meant was heterosexuality as a normative system, smash patriarchy, smash sexism, smash gender roles, smash masculinity and machismo. So it's very subtle, very nuanced. We wanted to smash the nuclear family and monogamy, and we had serious critiques of beauty, of desire and of love. This meant, of course, that we wanted to smash capitalism, imperialism, racism and war. And so, like I said, we were very sophisticated in our understanding. Some of my comrades would chant 1, 2, 3, 4, class, struggle, sex, war, which may not be an adequate summary of their politics. From Gramsci and Althusser, God forbid, Althusser, he was very important at this university, and later Foucault, what we prioritised was the ideological state apparatus, or, I don't know what you want to call them. Not just the law, but the whole courts and prison system. Medicine and psychiatry, media, education, religion and sport. We had alliances with the women's movement around reproductive rights and other issues, sexism, the land rights movement and the anti-racist movement, the trade unions, and particularly that's true in 1973 with the Builders Labourers Federation at Macquarie University, the environment movement, student movement, peace, anti-nuclear and international solidarity movement. But at the time, other movements were quite important. Anti-consumerism, anti-psychiatry, children's rights, censorship, drugs, prisons and sex work. There were difficult debates with parts of feminist movement around objectification, around roles like butch and femme, around sex work, around pornography, around leather and sadomasochism, around drag and transsexuals, transgender identities a bit later, around promiscuity and sex in public, and around intergenerational sex. In the mid to late 70s, we were doing defensive struggles around students and teachers, Penny Short, Greg William McCloskey. We were very inspired by the American movement, which we understood was under attack from the Christian right from 1976. And then we got the appeal from San Francisco for solidarity in 1978. We organised a meeting at this university. The movement had two different axes. I mean, we had chants that were essentially about, like ho-ho homosexual, were about sexual identity, I suppose. But we also had a lot of chants that were much more clear about what people might call intersectionality. So the chant that was very prominent prior to the Mardi Gras and during the Mardi Gras was stop police attacks on gays, women and blacks. So we situated our oppression alongside others. And we had chants like get your laws off our bodies. Post Mardi Gras was a very traumatic moment. It created an important political axis, two political axes. One was around lesbian and gay rights, and one was around civil liberties and police and the right to assembly and the struggle against summary offences. And so that created two different rationales for alliances across the social movements. The gay community and movement at the time split, and the majority of gay groups in Sydney, all of the gay businesses and the syndicate that owns half of Sydney, supporting the police, and the gay media opposed the first Mardi Gras and the second Mardi Gras. So it's quite a, watershed moment. Mardi Gras and the campaign after it marks a set of transitions, and I'll just say what they are without, saying my opinion of them. From a fatalist understanding that we would struggle forever against oppression and not make any gains, to an understanding that we could make advances and victories. from seeing ourselves as a marginal political question to centre stage socially and politically, from a liberation framework to a human rights framework, from a radical framework or revolutionary framework even to a framework of liberalism, from a framework around freedom to a framework around equality, from transformative politics to assimilationist politics. That is, we can be just like you, we can get married, the only difference we have is what we do in bed. From defensive struggles to offensive struggles, from anti-state demands, like get your laws off our body, to demands that ask the state to intervene on our behalf, like to protect us. From broad alliances for social transformation to much more narrowly focused gay demands. From an international focus to a focus on states, like New South Wales or Victoria or Tasmania. From movement building, using access to the new commercial community, to building the community defined by its commercial spaces. From collectives to elected or selected committees and specific groups like Gay Trade Unionists, Gay LP and so on. From mass action to lobbying, and from the pink triangle flag representing our history and oppression to the rainbow flag representing essentially liberalism. How long have I got? No time.
Pretty much no time.
Okay, I'll just do a list. So Mardi Gras shifted to summer in 81 and it marks a transition to the commercial scene. Women were alienated. Mardi Gras did a lot in terms of art, public art, law reform and HIV. It moved towards government funding and professionalisation, particularly after HIV for gay men. Now it's going much more for corporate sponsorship and seeking business solutions for our problems through corporate social responsibility. It's primarily for spectators and it helps in the branding of Sydney as an open and tolerant city. We argue for our rights because we're consumers and we bring a lot of money into the state, state economy, primarily for big business. It's hyper-regulated. Mardi Gras is intensively hyper-regulated. Obviously there's changing identities, most notably from drag or transsexual to transgender. Now we have a very complex alliance of identities, but with conflicting needs. We're much more individualised, and that fits with neoliberalism and commodification, so that we tend to do sex and politics and everything on apps, on phones, individually instead of collectively. And we have a problem about the alliance with imperialism and colonialism, so that the United States or the Australian government or the Israeli government argue that they're entitled to, engage in conflict to protect women's rights or because they're champions of, gay freedom. So there's an issue of pinkwashing we can talk a bit about, or the use of Mardi Gras and pride parades everywhere to showcase refugees from Muslim countries arguing in favour of Islamophobia, like the deployment of refugees to back up, say, Geert Wilders in Netherlands. Okay, I'll talk a bit later maybe.
Thank you, Ken. Now we have Geraldine.
Thanks very much, Ken. Sorry, is this working? Yeah. This is the second time that I've spoken alongside Ken, and it's always an honour and a privilege to hear from you. So thank you very much. I guess I'm going to pick up a little bit where Ken left off there. And I'm going to start by reflecting a little on the political terrain that I think we find ourselves in today in Australia. And it's a terrain that is post-marriage equality and also post the postal survey. So as all of you know, I'm sure, in December 2017, the Australian Parliament legislated same-sex marriage. And the Marriage Act, which in 2004 John Howard had changed to say marriage is only between a man and a woman, was amended again to allow two people, regardless of sex, to marry. And people were rightly relieved and are rightly relieved that this draconian piece of legislation is gone. However, I think we do need to understand that the celebrations at the time and the reflections now are bittersweet, because the changing of the law followed a drawn-out postal survey which was pushed by the right wing of the Liberal Party. And between September and November in 2017, the LGBTI community went through the humiliating process of having the validity of our lives and relationships subject to lengthy debate and then voted on. Of course, we know that the yes vote was strong. Every state in the country voted for marriage equality, and tens of thousands of people, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of people across the country, mobilised for mass yes rallies. And I think we can take heart from this. Ordinary people proved once again that they are leagues ahead of our bigoted rulers. Nevertheless, the survey saw a significant spike in homophobia. Posters appeared in the Melbourne CBD suggesting that gay parents sexually abuse their children with the headline, "Stop the Fags." And I think we have to understand the postal survey as 2 months in which every bigot in Parliament, in the news, on the streets and in our families received permission direct from Turnbull to deny the equalness of our relationships and to question how we lived our lives. Of course, the reality is that for years public opinion has been clearly in our favour, but the survey was a chance for the right in the Liberal Party to give us a kick in the guts before the inevitable happened and marriage equality passed into law. And I think to understand the terrain that we are in now, we have to understand that the effects of this have not gone away, and they haven't been ameliorated by the passing of marriage equality into law. During the survey, Mental Health Services reported significant spikes in LGBT people needing help, and we don't yet have the research on the effects now, but I'm sure we'll know in the coming year the kind of long-term effects of that period. And I think if you ask any gay or trans person you know, they'll likely tell you that the homophobes who harass on the streets are just a little bit more confident now after the postal survey. And I think we also need to understand that it's no accident that the vile racist Fraser Anning is now calling for a plebiscite on whether or not Australia should return to the White Australia policy. Marriage equality might have passed into Parliament, but I think the right did gain something out of the postal survey. They organised and articulated themselves, and now Anning thinks that they can turn that weapon on Muslims, migrants and refugees. So I think we find ourselves now in a somewhat contradictory situation. On the one hand, marriage equality is a win, and we do have to acknowledge that. It comes, after decades of mobilisations, and it's seen a massive shift in public opinion. And I think, as I said before, the yes votes and the mass mobilisations did show us that ordinary people reject the bigotry of the Liberals and are prepared to mobilise for it. On the other hand, the postal survey was profoundly demoralising for gay people and their loved ones. And the legislative tick of marriage equality does feel hollow in the aftermath of the survey. And I think to understand that, we do need to look quite clearly at the limitations of the Yes campaign and of the marriage equality leadership, and particularly their refusal to counter the No campaign to defend trans rights and to fight for safe schools. And for those who don't know, Safe Schools is the pro-LGBT kind of sex education and general education that the Liberals have been attacking for years now. So the Coalition for Marriage, which is one of the major campaign groups for the No campaign, focused a lot of their work into establishing a link between marriage equality, children, safe schools and gender fluidity. And people might remember their You Can Say No ad that aired on primetime TV during the postal survey, which essentially argued that if marriage equality passed, children would have more freedom to experiment with gender and sexual identity in schools. If only that had been the case. One mother one of the mothers featured in the ad laments the fact that her son was told he could wear a dress to school, and another, wide-eyed with apparent shock, describes kids in Year 7 being asked to role-play being in a same-sex relationship. What a horrifying situation. And we can laugh at it, and it is funny. But unfortunately, the homophobia and transphobia of this ad is no laughing matter, really, then or now, and nor was it limited to the fringe right. The campaign against safe schools, which then fed into the marriage equality debate, was orchestrated by the Liberal Party and by the tabloid press, and it started, its roots were in the campaign in New South Wales against the showing of Gay Baby in schools, the documentary about children of same-sex relationships. So there is a kind of more general homophobia and transphobia that existed around the No campaign, though, even if, the Coalition for Marriage is kind of Lyle Shelton's fringy little group. And I think, we understand that a lot of the anti-safe school content was strongly focused and is strongly focused on hysteria around gender fluidity in the classrooms, and particularly around trans children. So if you look at the Coalition for Marriage Equality's website, they have an entire section dedicated to gender identity, which includes a graph linking the introduction of safe schools to an increase in trans children presenting in medical clinics asking for, help with gender affirmation. And I think how that played out, unfortunately, in the postal survey is that the mainstream marriage equality movement, the leadership of the marriage equality movement, threw trans kids and safe schools under the bus. Rather than defending the program and the rights of our trans siblings, they sought to divorce the debate from any notion of gender or sex and simply focus on the respectability of committed gay couples. And I think we can see a continuation of the shifts that Ken talked about post-Mardi Gras in this kind of professionalised conservative politics today. So people will remember the pathetic Get Up ad, which features a heterosexual family and claims the debate is simply a matter of fairness. And this one went alongside the ad with the juice. Do people remember the juice ad, where it's a heterosexual family, and the parents are pouring out orange juice into cups and explaining that really marriage equality is about fairness, just like you wouldn't give one of your children more juice than the other kid. And it's no coincidence in these ads that they feature children wearing appropriately gendered school uniforms in a very explicit distancing from safe schools. And this was a very clear strategy that was articulated by the leadership of the marriage equality campaign. People might remember Tiernan Brady, who was flown from Ireland to be the political director of the Yes campaign in Australia. And he editorialised consistently throughout the campaign within the Herald Sun. And it was an effort to reassure the general public that the sanctity of heterosexuality and marriage would be very much intact after the survey and after the passing of marriage equality. In his own words, the day marriage equality passes, no one will be less married and no one will be more gay. And Yes campaigners were explicitly instructed not to speak out for trans rights or to challenge the No campaign. And it's good that since marriage equality has passed, some people, or mostly just Rodney Croome, a prominent marriage equality advocate and veteran of the 1990s referendum on decriminalisation in Tasmania, have actually spoken out against this strategy from the Yes campaign. He argued quite recently that it was a mistake to make marriage equality a small target, and that the campaign should have taken the opportunity to fight for safe schools and to lift up the voices of trans people. And Croome is right. It was a mistake to make marriage equality a small target, and that the Yes campaign distanced itself from anything like safe schools that was deemed to challenge the family and gender roles is why today marriage equality feels like a hollow victory. And I think to understand this, we have to look at the role of the nuclear family as fundamental to capitalism itself and fundamental to the oppression of LGBTI people. The nuclear family emerged with the growth of industrial capitalism. As peasants moved into cities and became workers, there was a crisis for the emerging ruling class, the bourgeoisie. Many of these workers were not producing children, or else their children were dying in factories and workhouses. And the question became, where would the next generation of workers come from? And in response to this, the ruling class led an ideological crusade for so-called family values. The home was promoted as a haven on earth, a place of domesticity, of virtue, stability, and love. Sex was permitted, but only within the bounds of heterosexual marriage. And anything outside those bounds, particularly sexual practices that were not reproductive, needed to be resolutely punished. Likewise, people whose gender expression did not fit with the strict roles assigned to men and women in the nuclear family were increasingly punished. In Britain, the number of death sentences handed down for sodomy increased in the early 1800s, along with new laws introduced in the 1820s. And in Australia, some of the first laws passed by the colonisers were to criminalise homosexuality. And these laws lasted until the gay liberation movement in the 1960s and 1970s challenged them and fought for the legitimacy of gay relationships and gay sexual practices. And the last anti-sodomy laws were not revoked in Australia until the 1990s. And I think we need to understand that the gains of the gay liberation movement mean that our ruling class have had to adjust. Some will tolerate, to an extent, gay relationships, and some of our rulers now see gay families as a tolerable version of the heterosexual nuclear unit. And Malcolm Turnbull reflected on this, in fact, on the day that marriage equality passed into law. He said, and I quote, "Former Prime Minister John Howard was most definitely not thinking of gay couples when he said in 1995, a stable, functioning family provide the best welfare support system yet devised. But the point is well made. Codependency is a good thing." The truth is, however, despite this adjustment from our rulers, the decriminalisation of homosexuality in Australia, the massive transformation in social attitudes towards LGBTI people would never have happened without a radical gay movement in the 1970s that was willing to challenge the sources of gay oppression, the nuclear family and capitalism itself. And Ken has done a really good job today of outlining that for us. So Stonewall riots in 1969, the dawn of the gay liberation movement saw gay men, lesbians, trans people all united against the rigidity of gender and sexuality represented in the nuclear family. The gay liberation movement fought alongside anti-racist movements, the movement against the Vietnam War, and the women's liberation movement. And in this, they were supported by large sections of organised workers. And Ken referred briefly to the pink ban at Macquarie University, when the BLF, the precursor to the CFMEU today, struck to defend the rights of a gay student, Jeremy Fisher, who'd been expelled from a religious college. And again in 1978, after the arrests at the first Mardi Gras, trade unionists and members of the Labor Party marched in the marches to drop the charges and to fight for the right to march. So today we find ourselves in a situation where marriage equality has been won, thanks largely, in fact, to the movement of people in the 1970s who were opposed to marriage. The irony is there, but nevertheless, we have won that. But homophobia and transphobia is alive and kicking, both in Australia and around the world. So there's research that's come out from GLAAD, which is the gay and lesbian kind of research group in the US, that has found that since the election of Trump, there's been a skyrocket in homophobic bashings across the US. And that they have an acceptability test, which they do a kind of survey, which found that people's sense of the acceptability of gay relationships has significantly declined since Trump's election. And of course we know in Australia, trans people are still restricted in their access to gender affirmation surgery, gay conversion therapy is still legal in every state but Victoria, and gay refugees are rotting on the hellholes on Manus and Nauru. I think, we need to remember that a fight back is possible, and, we should take heart from the stories that Ken tells from the 70s, that it is possible to have a radical movement that is not afraid to confront the rigidity of gender roles, that sides every time with the struggle of our trans siblings, and that is willing to challenge the nuclear family, and that sees our struggle as part of a much broader struggle against the sickness of the capitalist system. And I just wanted to leave you on a quote from Lance Gowland, who was one of the organisers of the first Mardi Gras, and you probably remember him from Riot, the ABC dramatisation. And he wrote in 1978 that in Campaign, which was one of the gay newspapers at the time, that the gay movement is a seed from which a new society will grow. He argued that it was possible to win a world where there are no oppressive sex roles and where we have control over our own lives. And I think, this is the kind of world that we want to win, and that we're fighting every day to win. So I did urge you all to join Solidarity and be part of that fight for a better world.